coach and training and everything like that. But I'm always interested to know how you found yourself getting into more of that movement optimism stuff. Did you kind of start with that viewpoint from when you first started training, or did you stumble upon it along the way?
Okay, so if we want to really go to where it started, I want to credit my dad. And
Okay.
he's not in strength and conditioning or fitness. He's a runner. But I remember fresh out of college, I was training him in the weight room, showing him some stuff, and I forget whether it was elbows flaring on a bench press or like his knees dipping in on a squat motion. It was one of the classics, right? And I corrected him, and he's like, "Oh, why is that such a big deal?" And I was like, "Well, you know, injuries can happen from those types of motions, so we don't want to do that in the weight room." And he just hit me back with a profound, "Well, then wouldn't you want to train that in the weight room?" And it was so fun. I gave him some like nonsense about how I was like, basically like some biomechanics mumbo jumbo, but that man, that stuck with me. And it was like fresh out of school. I was like peak of Dunning-Kruger, right? Felt like I knew everything. And that one extremely like logical question stuck with me to the point where that was like 12 years ago now. And I still remember, and it's like eating away at me to the point where as I started to be exposed to more of this movement optimism stuff, I'm like, this makes too much sense, you know? But that was like the definitive point where all of I remember learning about like valgus forces at the knee in a biomechanics course. I remember, you know what I mean? Like all of the classic stuff, landing profiles, etc. And being, rightfully at that point in time, scared of it. Valgus is bad. And just that one little bit of logic from somebody who, he's a smart guy, but he doesn't do anything as it relates to exercise science or anything. Yeah, and that just planted that seed that slowly over time got watered and grew into what it is now. I think another big part is that I worked for Brett Contreras for 2 years, and and our ability to like within that setting, I don't have a particular passion for glute training, but to work for somebody, man, we would weekly go over new papers that came out. Brett would, people would critique him, and I would be there as he was constructing like a long form rebuttal to it, and his ability to sift through research to challenge his own biases. I mean, it was a very, and then also just his process for social media. It started to show me that like it doesn't have to just be this yeah, I don't know. I wasn't super on board with like sharing a ton of my training and stuff I was doing with clients, and seeing the way that he went about that was very formative.
Yeah. Um, there's a few things there that are interesting. I suppose it's interesting that your dad, who I'm assuming was a beginner or at least kind of inexperienced in strength training, was the one who made you think about that. But I think that's from asking that question to a lot of other coaches who would categorize themselves as movement optimists. I think the hallmark is actually that they were open-minded enough to follow that thread after, that thought was initially brought up. I think the only reason that more people don't end up coming around to that way of thinking is that they hear what sounds like a very logical rebuttal to what they've been taught in college or certifications or even just from coaches they respect. And then they just kind of, there's too much cognitive dissonance. So they start to push it away as opposed to trying to tease that out. Like for me, it was kind of similar in that I worked in a CrossFit gym for a few years. So I saw a lot of people training at fairly high intensity with what would typically be termed as bad form. People doing, like you talked about, like the flaring the elbows on the bench press and not a particularly arched back position on squat and knee valgus. And I watched these people for like 4 or 5 years do this week in and week out, and nobody got hurt. I think something you touched on there is that like you start to realize when you think about it then that it's actually it's a even though it's just a model, and obviously it's not going to perfectly explain everything involving injury and movement preparation, it definitely seems to fit reality a lot more than the notion that if you just move perfectly, you're not going to get hurt. Because I'm sure you've seen it and I've seen it where people have moved perfectly and shit just happens because they either did a bad job with load management or it was just a bad day.
Yeah, I mean, perfect example. What was it now? Almost 3 months ago, I tore my adductor squatting.
I saw.
There was yeah, there was no breakdown in form. It was at roughly 80% of my 1 RM. It was the first rep of a set. Um, it was supposed to be. I was going to be doing 2 reps every minute on the minute for 12 minutes. And I was actually mic'd up because I had a series of Q&A questions. It was going to be a new format that I was going to do for YouTube. And yeah, first rep, go down into the hole, mic'd up, you can hear it, and yeah, I mean, talk about load management. Um, if you look at it, I did, man, out of the last 4 days, I had squatted 2 other times. They were 2 other variations, but that's a lot of redundancy. And then the day before, I have been sprinting pretty regularly, but before that, I'd had to take about 3 weeks off. And, I'll call myself out. I didn't recognize how quickly something like sprinting could become a novel stimulus again. I did drop my volume when I reintroduced it. I thought, I knew I was flying close to the sun. I've really been enjoying training lately, so I've been pushing my limits, and I know that, right? I like looking back at it, I certainly would not program that for a client, you know? But part of it for me is I do just enjoy this stuff, right? And sometimes flying a little bit close to the sun with something that you enjoy, it's good. And I don't view injury as like this ultimate downfall. Like, some people in the functional movement cult view it. It's like nearly a moral issue, right? Like
Yeah.
if you get hurt training, like that is just the worst thing. And I'm also in combat sports. Injuries happen all the time. How we deal with them is important. And I even took that as a chance to really attack my rehab head on. I wanted to share the injury. I wanted to share my progress. Um, because I think that, biological creatures experience injury and pain. And knowing how to deal with that is a skill that, man, way back in the day, I was a mess. I've always been very active. And it's, being active, doing things like wrestling, jiu-jitsu have always been my positive outlet. And in college, I tore my labrum in my shoulder and I was a mental wreck. Having those things taken away from me, I wasn't like, oh, how do I still train? I was like, man, everything's gone. Went to less healthy coping mechanisms, um, and it wasn't productive. I catastrophized. I was like, oh man, I'm gonna need surgery, whatever. Um, Eventually I pulled myself out of it and I didn't need surgery and I attacked rehab hard, but that is a skill that because I saw that it was so lacking in myself early on in my journey, it's something that I really try to work on with clients. And then I also try to preach it myself. I think with a lot of my combat sport athletes, they always see me sort of preaching how to deal with injuries, but they've never seen me really deal with one. So I thought this was a cool chance to really walk the walk, and show them that like this is how you handle an injury, that you can heal it how you hurt it, that you don't have to just sit around. I mean, then even that day, I continued my workout. I obviously didn't finish that squat, Imam.
Mhm.
But yeah, I had to do some upper body after that. The next day, I was doing leg extensions and hamstring curls. I was very proactive with that recovery. And I think that's important too. I think a lot of people who do have a platform will often hide that they've gotten hurt or at the very least will sort of like sweep it under the rug a little bit. But I think it's important for people to see so that when they go through something, especially something, again, mine, I moved well, right? My squat, it wasn't an ugly squat. It was at a
Yeah.
relatively low effort level. Uh, I should have flown through that EMOM. So yeah, I think it's a useful message to share with people. And I think that especially when someone is hurt, having seen something like that might give them a little bit of motivation to try to problem solve a little bit and try to work through it productively.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit too coincidental that the people who have big profiles and are always preaching about things like bulletproofing and injury being like this terrible thing that should never happen, somehow they seem to never be reporting their own injuries, and just statistically, it's pretty much impossible that people who are training that much wouldn't get hurt. So I think you're right that it's very important to show that injury is normal, and here's how I'm going to walk the walk and show you like how I deal with it. And I hurt my own back about a year and a half to 2 years ago, and similar to what you were saying, I couldn't really say exactly why it happened. I could pinpoint some load management that wasn't perfect, but then again, you get away with it so many times that it's hard to say for certain if it was really, bad training or not. But I definitely got a lot of insight into what people that I've trained before who've gone through injury, particularly back pain, would experience. I'm sure you had this with your adductor as well, like the psychological aspect of injury and trying to retrain your mind to be able to comfortably push and, kind of like take the brakes off when you're doing that exercise where you got hurt initially the first time. I'm sure you've probably had that with your squat, have you?
Yeah, so at first the limitation was very physical. I was doing Zercher squats. I think I did 95 pounds 1 week out from the injury. Just for a couple reps. I was doing body weight squats about 3 days out. I very much wanted to heal it how I heard it, right? I was also, after a week, I started to get into some like deep tier plyos because I felt, especially when I added speed, not a ton,
Mm.
right? Like deep tier plyos aren't crazy fast. They're not even a true plyometric, really. But they get that adductor when you're in that deeper hip flexion. And when you added a little bit of speed, I really felt that physical limitation. I'd say so a month out, 4 weeks out to the day, I squatted the same weight. Granted, that was 80% of my 1RM. It was tough. It was kind of scary, right? And since then, it's funny. Now I'd say I'm at a solid 95% of where I was. And I would say now I'm at the stage where there is a lot of that mental limitation, right? Now, as I'm getting back over 90% of my 1RM, I'm doing that and I'm doing it somewhat regularly, but I haven't yet hit like my old 1RM. And honestly, this stage of it, I'm not really rushing. I do think it's important to consistently challenge that limiter. But I'm also aware of I've gotten back into sprinting too, keeping my volume super low. But I've gotten back up to higher intensities. Yeah, I think that mental side of it is gonna hang around for a little bit. But what I'm not doing is just hoping that it'll resolve without challenging it. I am challenging it. I'm trying to do it at what I view as like a happy medium. Because the way I see it, there was damage for sure. There is potentially some if I did put my 1RM on there, would I get that today? I'm not sure. I don't know if I'm quite 100%. Maybe some of that is just from a little bit of deconditioning because I was really pushing the squat hard for a while. So yeah, I'm taking my time with it, but I am making sure to sort of check myself and challenge myself and not impose any limitations that aren't actually there, So I'm doing different things to challenge myself. Yeah, and I think that's kind of the process, right? Like you have to challenge it, but within reason. And I would assume that within the next month or so, I should be right about where I was. I think the fear, I'm largely getting over it. Um, it's funny, I've actually been recording my sets, and I think that my eccentric is now significantly slower than it
Yeah.
used to be.
Same thing
And
happened with
so
my squat and my deadlift with my back.
yeah, and again, like is that like a dysfunctional thing that I've adopted? At this stage, I think that it's just me wanting to be a bit more protected. And I think that that's also potentially what's contributing to slightly less output. But it's not like I'm at 50%. So I'm not that concerned with it, right? I'm at that last bit that was a tough uh those were tough weights for me to work through initially. So it's not so crazy that, within 3 months of that injury that I'm still a little bit limited there. And I haven't had any major setbacks. So I'm pretty happy with the progress that I made. I'm happy that that first 80%, 90% happened so quickly. And now I'm not rushing that last bit because if you look at, some of these muscular or tendon injuries, they can hang around for a little bit. So I'm not really sweating it.
Yeah, and I think recording your sets is key. That's something that I've done as well, and it's great to get that bit more of an objective view of what's really happening. And God, I found when I first started getting back into things like deadlifts, I was thinking I had 3 or 4 reps in the tank, and I'd look at the video and I'd be like, shit, there's like closer to 10 reps in the tank on that set, and I need to trust in my body a little bit and like just give this a go. And the worst case scenario is I might have a bit of a flare up, and then I learn from it.
For sure,
Um,
but eventually you get back to a point where that process is pretty much what it would be before the injury. We
yeah,
get wrapped up in our head about like being overly concerned with it, but if you saw a client perform a set with, the same bar speed and everything else, you'd probably be like, yeah, you could have pushed a little bit harder there. And there's
yeah,
nothing
yeah.
wrong with holding yourself to that same standard.
I think one of the most unfortunate things that injuries do that really takes a long time to get past, happened to me with a knee injury I got from squatting, is that it makes you start analyzing sensations around a joint that you may have never even thought about before. And you might have been experiencing to some kind of subconscious level. Like you might have always had a little bit of like a pop that happened in your knee when you go into the bottom of a squat. You might have always felt a little bit of tightness there in your warm-up sets, but because you weren't experiencing pain in it before or had never injured it, it wasn't something you were fixating on enough to notice. But then after you hurt somewhere, I found this has happened to me and a lot of people that I've coached. You start going into every session and every set of a specific exercise thinking, is there anything weird happening there? And I think getting past that can take a long time because, to a certain extent, I don't know if you would agree, I think it's probably not necessarily realistic to expect there to be no sensations around joints.
Yeah, I mean, it's a trauma response, right? And I think if you and I were therapists and somebody had trauma where in their childhood home, people were raising their voices a lot, and that was a trigger for them. Someone raising their voice or getting a little bit animated might trigger them, even though it's not meant for any sort of negative outcome.
Yeah,
And with that, they have to sort of learn to process it and recategorize it. And I think, the sensations coming in through a joint are very much the same thing. We might be hypersensitized to something. It might be a bit of a trigger. We have to be able to take a step back, really, really ask ourselves, like, okay, was that worth? I think something that helps with that is reflection after the fact. You're
yeah.
gonna feel things, you're gonna react to them in the moment the way that you are, and it might be really, really tough to actually just change it in that moment. But if you can self-reflect afterwards, maybe you feel that sensation and you cut your set of squats early that day, right? And the next day you wake up and you feel pretty good, right? And you're like, okay, well, is that because I made a good call, or is that maybe because I preemptively ended things when I didn't have to?
Mhm.
Right? And you can sort of challenge yourself on it and be like, you know what, maybe I cut that a little bit early. Maybe there wasn't really something going on there?
Yeah. Speaking of Greg Lehman, he has a great analogy about this. I think it was something like, if a fire alarm gets set off because of a fire, there was good reason for it to initially get set off, but it can become faulty. And then you can find yourself at a point months later where somebody having a cigarette outside or something being heated up in the kitchen is enough to set the fire alarm off again. And that was meant to be an analogy for the nociception pain response that our bodies have after a very legitimate injury that probably had structural damage involved has happened. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the signals you're getting are an actual valid representation of you being in danger or damage happening. And I think actually the example you gave there is good because when I first hurt my back, I was getting nerve sensations, kind of like sciatica type symptoms down my left leg into my foot. And it's crazy. Like if I'm going in to do deadlifts and I'm going up to a weight that I haven't done before, or like since the injury, sometimes I'll get a a slight kind of fuzzy, tingly feeling in that foot. And I'm like, it's fine the other 97, 99% of the week. There's no way that just getting ready to do a deadlift could coincidentally have this happening. And then, like you said, I do the set and then get up the next day and I'm fine. And that's one more piece of data in the bank of evidence that actually that signal isn't always accurate.
For sure. And I think not getting carried away with how we feel in the moment. I mean, again, I like to really bring it to sort of like a therapy uh, setting for an analogy because there is that emotional component, right? If you love being active, if you love pushing new numbers in the gym and stuff, having that taken away from you, especially in a painful setting,
Yeah.
is traumatizing. And I think when we dismiss that side of things, we're forgetting about the fact that we are these emotional creatures, right? And I think really being able to separate sometimes, again, after the fact, when the emotions have died down, you can sort of look back at that and you could be like, all right, I think I was catastrophizing a little bit. I think next time that this happens, I'm going to work through it a little more. I'm, not going to be reckless per se, but I'm going to challenge that. And I think if you're willing to challenge yourself, if you're willing to sort of audit your efforts and be real with yourself. Be like, hey, here I made a good decision. Here, maybe I was a little bit like preemptive about like, pulling this away. You can sort of keep yourself in check. I think recording yourself is a great way to look at things because we're constantly coaching other people. And when I go through this process with somebody else, I'm like, hey, I get that this was a traumatizing thing for you, but right now, your lifts are looking great. There is no reason for me to think that we can't just inch a little bit higher effort, right? A little bit closer to failure. Um, and just holding yourself to that same standard. And I think the thing that's most useful with that is a separation of a little bit of time to remove some of that emotional side of it. In that moment, it's going to be tough, right? When you first get that sensation down your leg, like to think that you can make a purely objective decision is honestly like fooling yourself. And that's okay, right? Like err on the side of caution. Do what you think you need to in that moment, but then don't be afraid to reflect on it later and challenge yourself.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a really good way of framing it. And it's that biopsychosocial model of like there is other elements to pain other than just purely your biomechanics or just the sensation of pain. There's all the other aspects, the emotions involved in it, your identity being attached to training and whatever. And um to somewhat change gears a little bit, there was something I actually found quite cool that you posted recently. You were talking about, this maybe more recent phenomenon in the the context of the history of fitness, which is like science-based fitness content, or at least content that purports to be science-based and that generates an awful lot of clicks and engagement. Um, do you think that a lot of the big names in the industry are potentially starting to overstep the mark into not even just clickbait, but clickbait that maybe does more harm than good sometimes in terms of what the average person who looks at it comes away with when they're in their understanding?
Yeah, I like how you made that distinction, right? Because oftentimes people they throw things out there, the word clickbait. And honestly, I do think something that a lot of science communicators fail to do well is to be aware of attention
Yeah.
as like a currency on social media. I think if I'm an effective communicator, if I'm trying to connect with a client, and I'm citing different, meta-analyses or whatever, and their eyes are glossing over. It doesn't matter how correct the info is if it doesn't land properly. And we all recognize that in person, right? You meet clients where they're at when you talk to them in person, and that's all well and good. Um, a lot of truly science-based practitioners aren't aware of that on social media, and they don't get the attention that I feel that they could get if they were just a little bit more aware of how they package the info,
Yeah.
how maybe they use the first couple seconds of a video to grab somebody's attention or to speak to a specific avatar. So don't get me wrong in the sense that all clickbait, quote unquote, is wrong. But like you said, clickbait that does more harm than good, that's truly disingenuous or intellectually dishonest, I think there's a line to be walked there. And it's tough, right? Because that's why I think if you're referring to that Menno post that I made, that's why I opened it up as a question because, you go to his posts and they do garner a lot of attention. And a lot of people are then reading the study in detail to then be able to tear down his title, which again, is that like a net negative? You're getting people to read these studies and think about it critically and even challenge him. So like in that sense, maybe it's good, but how many people, when you have a platform that big and you have a title that is that sensationalist? I mean, my issue with that post was the fact that he's sharing a study which has a title. The study, it had like we will sometimes attack people because they only read the abstract, which by the way involves the title of the study and then has like a brief write up. And sometimes we'll be like, oh, you're not getting the right message from it, or you're not critically analyzing it because you're only reading the abstract. But what about taking this already short packaging and condensing it more and then sensationalizing it more and coming to a conclusion that really I don't think the authors of the original paper would ever dare to claim. Again, I do think I think it's a little much, but again, I mean, he has a big platform. He does share literature that might not get the same attention otherwise. That's a tough one to answer. And there are other people in the science-based space, people bringing up certain tier lists for exercise, which again, man, we're looking at if we're going to rank quad exercises, right? I mean, if you're doing something that involves a pretty high degree of knee extension, and that person is loading that and progressing it over time, they're doing a good job for their quads. Like we don't need to now that tier list. What I actually do with clients, a lot of ones where I write them custom programs. I'm constantly getting feedback for different exercises, ranging from how well they feel that this exercise agrees with their body, even just things in terms of how much they like it, right?
Mhm.
Like preference is something I want to hear about because in the long run, I kind of come up with a quote unquote tier list for that individual based on a bunch of these different things. And they're not the same one client to the next. So for me to take all of these quad exercises and just come up with a tier list at large is disingenuous to the entire training process. I think if you and I went through our favorite quad exercises, as we should, they won't be the same. Like they shouldn't be. We've gone through different things. You said you had a knee injury squatting. I've never had that. So the fact that you and I have different experiences, like we should have a different tier list. And as long as they're actually quad exercises, right? There's plenty of exercises that are lower body exercises that maybe involve a degree of knee extension, but it's not the primary it's not stressed to any great degree. Take like a hip thrust, for example, right? That's probably shouldn't be at the top of our list for quad exercises. But within anything that falls under knee extension, how is that not valid if you can progress it over time? Those are the things where I think it's a bit problematic. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong to share a tier list, but when you're doing everything on your brand as science-based or you're a PhD, I think you can kind of parse together some of the people I might be referring to right now. I think again, it starts to get to the point where it's a bit disingenuous, and I find that particularly disappointing when I know these people are writing peer-reviewed material. where they would never dare to do that. So it's not like they're incapable of communicating this in a way that is more intellectually honest. They're actively choosing not to, and that's the stuff I find kind of disappointing. The Menno one, I don't know, is like again, he's getting people talking about studies. That's ultimately the reason I opened that one up to a question is because I wanted to hear what people think, and
Yeah.
overwhelmingly, people were kind of disappointed with it, which does sort of fit what I'm leaning towards. But some of them are just so far on the side of just blatantly disingenuous that it saddens me because I think as somebody who does read literature. Um, I'm constantly trying to walk that line myself. I'm trying to get people's attention. I'm trying to share methods that I do think provide a lot of value. And sometimes in the way that you share it, you're not just going to directly quote, multiple paragraphs from a study. You're going to paraphrase. You're going to make things potentially a little bit more black and white. And I think that's normal. I mean, Instagram is not the same medium as a peer-reviewed journal. But there does become a point where I think that it starts to paint the wrong message. And I think at large, the average person reading that content is not going to go to the source material. They're going to take it at face value. And when that is happening far more often than people actually going to the source material, the further that you've led them away from that, the more that you're painting, in my opinion, the wrong picture.
Yeah, fully agree. And something I would be interested to get your perspective on is, you know, an estimation of who really are the audience that's consuming posts like these and media like these. It's my speculation based off having been a young, stupid, inexperienced lifter at one point and having socialized with many people who were like that. Uh, and peruse what were like the go-to sites for this kind of information back in the day that maybe you might have gone to, like T Nation, Elite FTS. Um, I believe that the majority of people who are consuming, let's say at like intermediate to advanced level information, which I assume people like say like Dr. Milo Wolf with his tier list videos, Jeff Nippard, I think they believe that's for the most part who is watching their content. But I think it's actually mostly people who are much closer to beginners. And the reason why is, again, my own experience, but also the amount of messages that I get and conversations that I have with, kids aged 18 to 25 or people who are just starting off in the gym and they're massively confused by all of this kind of like optimal information online when in reality 9 times out of 10 if I was going to pinpoint like what those people actually need to be told, it's shut up, get on a program and fix your diet and sleep. And just do that for 6 months to a year and
In
stop
that
trying to,
order.
yeah, and stop trying to optimize things. And where I think it starts getting very tricky is that these guys are scientists, like you said, they do peer-reviewed literature. Somewhere between being a hyper academic and liver king, there's somewhere in that continuum is a gray area where you're trying to put out good content, but you're also trying to meet people where they're at. And I think at a certain point, you actually have to almost probably ahead of time make a deliberation on like what is my hard stop? Like what are the principles or values that I'm not willing to bend on for the sake of more views? Because I think both of us could agree these guys could go even further with the way that they are shaping their headlines, the things they're saying that are supposedly backed by science, and they would definitely get more engagement for it. So yeah, I don't know what your perspective is on that, but I think there's a big mismatch between who's consuming their content and the effect that that message is actually having versus what they seem to think it's about.
Yeah, if we're looking at the effect of people and potentially it being a much younger, less experienced audience, I will give those guys the benefit of the doubt that I don't see as many people parroting them as say like the Paul Carter acolytes.
Yeah.
Because and talk about someone who speaks in absolutes,
Yeah.
doesn't really explore nuance, never admits that he was a little bit off or wrong in the past. You know, sure, I might have my gripes with. I think Nipper does a pretty good job, especially considering the size of the audience that he does still appeal to. Milo Wolf, yeah, I think that like, the whole stretch thing, is it scientific to just really keep falling back onto the same thing and like obviously like pushing like your confirmation bias? Like I don't think that's overly scientific, but I also don't hear like these swaths of young people who are then also trying to be influencers when they're only a couple years into training, perfectly like quoting Milo Wolf. Like
Mm.
he does, I do think that sometimes he might be a little bit sensationalist, that he, appeals to his confirmation bias, etc. But he does also explore some caveats, right? And like there was one that he shared recently about how lifters don't need to do cardio. I think that was a big net negative. But again, if we look at, again, the effect, I don't really hear these young lifters parroting that ad nauseum. Whereas Paul Carter has really done, he claims that it's not on purpose, that he's just genuine. Him and I actually had a long back and forth via DM before he blocked me.
God love you.
Um, where I was telling him like, hey, dude, credit to you. Like this seems very calculated and you do a great job of getting people on board. He's like, this isn't calculated. I'm just being me. I'm like, okay, whatever, dude. Uh, in between him cussing me out and everything else. But I think the effect there on a lot of these newer coaches, and I think we're seeing some people now calling out the optimal crowd. And it's, you see a lot of these really young, inexperienced lifters that don't have a wide array of clients where they can see that sometimes it's not this black and white uh, thing anymore. Where, yeah, I think if we're looking at the actual effect, I as much as it might irk me sometimes the way that some of these guys may communicate, really the only downstream effect that I see consistently is from like the Chris Beardsley and Paul Carter type of sect, where
Chris
again,
Beardley, he's the hypertrophy research guy, is he?
well, he's
Or
not a
strength and
research.
conditioning research guy?
So he shares a ton of research, but see, I think the difference here is with him and Paul Carter, these aren't guys that are putting stuff up for peer review. They're science communicators in a way, and they interpret a ton of research and they do a good amount of reading, but they're not involved on the same level. And I think there is something far more problematic with that. I was actually breaking down with some of my coaches the other day, a couple Chris Beardsley stories that he was sharing. And I think that when we get overly myopic in terms of, let's say, hypertrophy, he made some wild claims on his story the other day. And again, I work with
Was
a
this
lot of,
about the atrophy thing?
it actually wasn't, but I think that that's another example.
Okay.
No, these are two that I view pretty cut and dry, especially working with many athletes outside of purely the realm of hypertrophy, where he was talking, one of the subjects was on creatine, where people were asking about creatine. He goes, all that I see creatine doing is adding water to the muscle. It doesn't improve hypertrophy or performance. And that's just a wild claim to make. And I think he's doing that again based on the confirmation bias of his own hypertrophy stimulus model and things along that nature, where even if we're just looking at an influx of intracellular water, it's not just water that's entering the cell. That will improve performance. Also, in terms of just energy system substrates, like to think that creatine only makes the muscles look bigger is a wild take. He had another wild take where someone was asking him about power work, and he makes the claim that there is no such thing as power work because power is made up of force and speed. So at any point in time, you're only doing something for force production or speed, as if speed can occur in a vacuum. Like you could actually make the argument that it's only power work and it's only power work that's going to occur at different velocities based on the amount of force that you need to produce, right? Like it's just such a wild claim. And it's because he's so myopic with hypertrophy that it's almost like, when people hold you as this expert, why not just I would rather him not speak on those subjects than to speak so like absolute about something that he just doesn't spend time doing, you know? So I think those guys, if we look at like the downstream effect and how it's actually influencing lifters and even other like newer, younger influencers, I think those guys might have some of the most egregious, downstream effects.
Yeah, and it goes both ways because people aren't excused from making these, egregious black and white claims just because there's a market for it. But at the same time, they are directly rewarded for it. People seem to really want to be spoon-fed information with a high degree of certainty. And I'm always really skeptical of anybody who has a complete inability to just say, I don't know sometimes. Like one of the coaches I hold in the highest esteem in terms of like their understanding of how training works on like a practical level is Jim Wendler. And I've heard Jim Wendler, he does like live Q&As now on YouTube, and obviously he wrote the 531 books, which were like a huge thing at the time. I've heard him many times on his Q&A. Somebody comes in and asks him something about like injuries or things like that, or something very specific about nutrition, or even something about some new research that got published about hypertrophy. He'll just say, "Look, man, it's outside my wheelhouse. I don't know. If you want to ask me something about the program or about, getting stronger on the lifts, I'll tell you." And I think one of the reasons why he's so good is because, like all great coaches, he doesn't expect more certainty and accuracy than is really realistic from training. Like there's principles that you have to follow, and outside of that, like I had somebody, I'm sure you have this all the time, messaging me about the number of sets to do. Like, is 3 sets okay for hypertrophy on like upper body or some chest exercise? And I was like, yeah, it's within the guidelines. You should be fine. He's like, okay, well, what if I'm doing arms afterwards? Would that change it? Would it be okay if I just did like 2 sets of curls, or should I be doing more like 5 or 6? And I was like, at a certain point, you just have to do the program and just see what happens. Because there are people out there, whenever they do these hypertrophy studies, there's outliers on either end of that bell curve. There's people who got amazing results doing 1 or 2 sets, and there's people who are the ones everybody wants to talk about who have to do like 50 sets per muscle group a week or whatever the hell they're publishing it at now. But like it's just an average. Like you have to like go away and do it and see what works for you, and nobody can spoon feed you any like certainty that this will 100% work.
Yeah, man. I mean, even myself, if I was just to go by what works for me, I am one of those relatively low volume, high intensity individuals. That's how I respond best. I actually, uh, maybe about 8 months ago, had one of my coaches write me a program, and I really tried to do a bit more volume per week. And maybe it's the fact that I concurrently train jujitsu. Maybe it's the fact that I'm also, concurrently doing cardio. We could look at a million different factors. I've come to the notion that I respond best to higher intensities and lower volumes. And I challenged that with one of my coaches and had him write me a program, and I ran it for 6 months. And ultimately, I came, I found my way back to this conclusion. It beat me up a ton. It it didn't garner me any crazy results. And I was like, yeah, I'm one of those guys that does just respond better to lower volumes. Um, but yeah, I mean, we if you've trained a good number of people, you've had people who are like non-responders to these lower volumes and they can handle a ton more volume. They're still, I don't like to lead off with that. I start with my programming more towards the center of the bell curve because that will catch the majority of people. I make sure that before I start to add volume, that I'm really auditing their effort and I'm making sure that because at a certain point, you add volume before somebody gets good at training with a higher degree of effort, and that will be a limiter on their effort, right? So then sometimes I do think that people too early in their journey may assume that they're a non-responder because they've just never learned to train hard. So they add more and more volume and they're like, look, I'm doing these crazy sessions and I'm not even seeing growth. That does happen. And I do think there's like an order of operations. So I start people with more sensible middle of the road volumes, make sure that they're training with a high degree of effort. But then I'm also open to the fact that just because something works for me or works for the center of that bell curve, over time, if I'm training a good number of people, I'm going to have those outliers on either side. So I like to be aware of that, and I like to be flexible with my programming to account for that. So yeah, I think that's a huge deal. You said something really interesting there that I wrote down, and I think that this happens more. So you said people want a high degree of certainty, right?
Yeah.
These younger lifters, they're going into the gym, they're seeing conflicting info, they're putting in effort, they want to maximize their effort, they want their results quickly. And you were sort of saying that in a hypertrophy context, where I actually think that it's far more dangerous is pain and rehab because we see the same thing, right? And if we now sort of look at that functional cult again, when someone's injured, and let's say they come to you or me, right? And they go, "Yeah, man, I was deadlifting and I rounded a little, and so my form was off. So I want to pay you to make sure that my form's good, so I don't get hurt again." And you or I might take that balanced approach, however we choose to communicate it, but we're not gonna just sort of pin the tail on the donkey and be like, "Oh yeah, okay, we're gonna fix your form and you're gonna be totally fine." We take that like balanced approach and even say, "Hey, I don't have a high degree of certainty that that was necessarily it." From the perspective of the person who is a bit traumatized from that pain,
Mm.
they don't feel good going to somebody who doesn't have a high degree of certainty. It appears as if that person doesn't truly have expertise, especially when it's stacked up against someone who goes, "Follow me and you will feel no more pain. We will fix all of your movement dysfunctions. We will get you to where if you train like me, you will never experience an injury like that." Like from the point of a consumer who doesn't really have that breadth of knowledge, again, I think it's funny because I do think that sometimes um, we fail people as practitioners if we don't give them a sense of security. And this is something that I think that in the pain management and rehab, even if that's not what you do, right? I'm not a PT, I'm not a chiro. That is not my primary area of focus. But something that I think a lot of us who are aware of, the biopsychosocial pain model, the complexities of pain, any sort of understanding or knowledge, or just an idea of the breadth of something like pain science, if we don't do a good job of communicating security and like confidence in our ability to pull them out of it, even if we don't have that diagnosis or that answer or whatever that thing may be, sometimes our knowledge may not just do us a disservice, but if we look at how expectation affects outcomes and affects sensation and pain and everything else, this is something that I've been struggling to sort of put into words because I really want to see the more evidence-based community do a better job of meeting people where they're at when they're in pain, not by being intellectually dishonest, but like something that I've been taking as an approach more recently with clients in person. And again, I'm sort of struggling with how to get this out on more of like a social media side of things. But what I tell them is, even though I can't tell you that it's because you rounded perfectly, even though I can't sell you this fantasy of you'll never feel pain again, what I do want to get across to you as the person standing in front of me who is desperate to not feel this way again, I will not promise you any sort of like pain-free utopia, but what I will promise you is we are going to build the skills so you can better deal with pain. We're going to build the skills so that you can navigate that space when you're in pain and still find a way to train. And I think falling back on like, how can I provide this person the security and the certainty they're looking for without lying to them, is something that I think a lot of us do a very poor job of. And I don't think we should let our realistic understanding of these complexities leave us in a place where we're giving this person who is desperate for an answer a non-answer, because that's one of the worst things we could be doing. And I see it all too often. I've lost clients to it, right? I've had people go to these crazy, wacky people who promise them the world because I stood there going, well, I don't know if it's that, blah, blah, blah. And I give them a non-answer as opposed to, hey, I don't think that's the singular reason for your pain, but I can help you. I can provide value and I can get you out of this vicious cycle. It might not be the way that you think. And quite frankly, like another thing that I like to tell them is I'm going to provide you an answer that is very different than your preconceived notion. And quite frankly, that's where expertise does its best. If I go to a mechanic and he does something to my car that I could have done anyways, why did I go to that mechanic? Right? If it's the exact problem I thought it was, and it's the piece that I have laying around in my garage, etc., why did I go to that person? Right? When they do something that's different than my process, that is the expertise worth outsourcing to. And I sort of I plant that seed early, and I really try to communicate to them that I'm not going to blow smoke up your ass with like these reductionist single answers, even though I know that's what you want, and I speak that into existence. I go, I know this is what you're looking for, and I'm not going to do you that disservice for the sake of your business. However, that doesn't mean that I'm not confident. That doesn't mean that I can't help you. And that doesn't mean that we can't, a few months from now, look back at the progress we've made and you go, man, I feel so much more confident lifting again. I feel so much better about my ability to deal with any sort of injuries that may happen down the line. And this is like man, it's a very tough road to walk based on that degree of certainty, right? Like, how do we not do them the disservice of saying, of giving them this overly reductionist answer for the sake of their business, but at the same time, meet that emotional human and provide them a sense of, okay, I'm in the right place, I'm doing the right thing, and I'm bought into the process. It's a tough line to walk, and I don't think enough of us talk about that side of things. Especially, I mean, that applies to hypertrophy, but it also really applies to pain. And I think pain is more emotionally motivated than simply hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is just like, man, I just want to get this stuff done. I want to look better. I want to, you know what I mean? And like that's easier to navigate because they're not driven by this desperation. But pain is a bit different. And I think that if we don't recognize that for the emotional driver that it is, sometimes we don't provide the setting that's necessary for someone to just have confidence, which when we're looking at outcomes with pain and sensation and everything else, that confidence does play a role. And that's even where, sure, these guys are charlatans. And I think painting the picture of a pain-free life will provide problems down the line. But in the moment that that person's in pain, I actually think that that can be a very good thing for them if we just zoom in on that one moment. Also, because most things have like a positive natural history, right? It's just going to resolve if you don't beat the shit out of them. So neither the functional guy or someone who is more science-based is going to beat the shit out of them, but the functional guy is going to give them that confidence and they're bought in. And then what do you know? Once they've done that, they've earned this like undying trust from them and they become another one of those acolytes that just like repeats that stuff, right? So I think it's also important for us that are more evidence-based to also provide that sense of security without lying to the person. And that's a tough line to walk.
it's very tough to walk. I think it in part depends a lot on the kind of person who's in front of you. Um, a quote that I'm always reminded of that I think is very relevant to that kind of scenario is that expectations are resentments waiting to happen. And I
Like that.
think that, yeah, I can't remember. Somebody said it on a podcast I listened to years ago, but I just thought it was very good that I think we have to be very careful about striking the balance between being compassionate and meeting people where they're at in terms of what their narratives are around pain and movement, while also not trying to be a poor man's version of the functional trainer to them by trying to get them to a destination that doesn't exist of pain-free living and never getting injured again. And I found with some people, not everybody, there's clients I've had before who I feel like it's not really worth challenging their bias yet because I think okay, I could probably work around, like say for example, the guy who thinks that he got hurt because his technique was bad. Maybe there's a way I can work around that while improving his load management or whatever, and we get him some results, and there's a doorway open for more education. But some people I have found I have to kind of plant a pretty firm flag from the outset that like if you are going to work with me on this, you need to commit to like the idea that there are going to be setbacks. I think my own back injury taught me that a lot, that like giving people an expectation that pain and injury is going to be a linear rehabilitation process and that you're not going to have flare-ups, I think is the kind of thing that sets people up to panic and start doubting you. Whereas I found that when I say from the outset, like, we're going to work on this. By the way, odds are it's not going to be perfect and you are going to have a flare up, but odds are also that if we persist and just make an adjustment, you're going to keep getting better and more functional. Dare I say the word? It's, getting back to your day-to-day tasks and then your training and everything. But it is, I think one of the biggest things that helped me was actually realizing how normal injury and pain are and how many people are going around day to day with little aches and pains that they just don't talk about because maybe they also don't realize how common it is. I remember on my Instagram a few years ago, I put up something just out of interest where I was like, how many of you guys have long-term chronic pain? And people were hitting me up left, right, and center with like my elbow hurts every time that I bench press for the first couple of sets, but then it goes away because I've learned that it's not the end of the world. My back hurts when I get out of bed, but then I go for a walk and it feels better. And I think that's part of the conversation as well that needs to be talked about more is normalizing that like you're not the anomaly if you're experiencing pain and it doesn't go away after 6 weeks of rehab. And maybe it will stick around to some extent, but that doesn't mean that it's going to stop you from doing what you want to do.
Yeah, pain is a feature, not a bug of like biological systems,
Mm.
right? Like acting like it's this dysfunctional bad thing. Like it's not. It's deeply wired into us, right? Like it's going to happen. Something that you were talking about in terms of what was that quote again? Expectations or what was it?
Expectations are resentments waiting to happen.
Okay, so something that I like to do. Um, and again, maybe this isn't the most efficient way to go about it, but I have seen really good results from this. Oftentimes when pain, when they're in that flare up now and they're seeking you out, providing that sense of security again without painting the picture this is never going to happen again, but just focusing on the here and now and what are like the baby steps we can take to move forward, right? And as soon as they start to see improvement, an analogy that I use for them to paint a more productive expectation, as they're like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm out of this already. I'm like, cool. So something that I want to talk to you about is the fact that you may experience another flare up in the near future or further down the line. And I'm telling you this not because I'm trying to rain on your parade, but I like to look at it and I give them this analogy or story from my childhood. So I grew up in a really small town. And something that we would do in elementary school, there would be this day where there was an assembly, and the local firemen would come in and talk to the kids about fire safety, and then they would actually drive around the town at night. You would come up with a fire escape plan with your family about like how you're going to get out of the house, where you're going to meet, and then you would leave a light on and the fire truck would drive by, right? Just showing that like you came up with that fire escape. Now, they did that not because they're saying your house is going to burn down one day, right? They're not trying to rain on your parade and say that everything's going to be taken away from you. But in that high stress, high emotion moment of, oh my God, there's this large out of control flame, and people might go, "Oh my God, I need my photo albums. I need that." Like instead, you have a course of action that is productive and it's planned out, and then a check-in point. And what I try to develop with them is our fire escape. Look, when this flare up happens, these are the really low grade exercises or things that we've done that should be doable as soon as a flare up gets set, right? So we have this like immediate action that you're doing because in the high emotional state of, oh my God, my back hurts again, not having an action to feel like you're working on it allows you to be very wrapped up in those emotions. I want them to have that fire escape plan. I want them to take some immediate action, and then I want them to check in with me, and from there, we develop a path moving forward. And I think setting that expectation, one, that this flare up can and very well may happen again, so that when it happens, it's a little bit less of this emotional thing because they've expected it, right? We've talked about it. They've already visualized, okay, when this happens, and maybe it's something that ultimately isn't going to cure the problem, right? Something that I love for people that have had like back pain is if they have like one of those glute loops, just doing some banded abductions again to start to be able to get a level of activity. Can you walk yet? Can you go for a 15-minute walk outside, right? If you can't, revert back to your banded abductions. It might be, there could be a million really low grade things that you do depending on what the injury is, whatever, right? But they have that fire escape. They have those things where they can immediately feel like they're working on the problem, and then they check in. And I think that having that allows you to understand that this could happen again. And when it does, you don't overly catastrophize. You're like, okay, I've thought about this. I know what I'm doing. I'm not going to get wrapped up in all this other crap. I'm going to do these couple things and then I'm going to check in. And even at that check-in point, instead of them checking in where they don't know what to do, they didn't expect this, they thought that they were out of the woods for forever. And then they ask you, and maybe it's a time when you as a coach, you're busy. Maybe you're coaching somebody else, maybe you're at home doing something and you can't help them immediately. Sometimes that can be so like, it's like an emotional firestorm. But instead, they have their go-to tasks. By the time they're reaching out for a check-in, they've already felt like they've worked on it. A lot of times, the severity of the flare-up is maybe a little bit more manageable, right? And I think that does it provides it's a skill that we're building, right? Like, how do I start to work on this problem without making it worse? How do I take action in a way that I know how before reaching out to further expertise? And then it also doesn't make them reliant on like an immediate answer because they've already sort of done the short-term things. The only thing I'm going to provide in the next 12 to 24 hours is like, hey, this is what our next week is going to look like, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's very helpful because then I'm not painting that picture of like, hey, we're never going to have this happen again. It's like when we do, this is how we're going to deal with it productively. And then this is how I'm going to still step in and give you expertise, but still giving you the autonomy to start to deal with the problem on your own.
Yeah, I think that is a great plan to put in place for people. And I think so much of what works well for training and pain comes back to the concepts in Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb, like the idea of building the well before you're thirsty and not leaving yourself vulnerable to what might even seem like a 1 to 5% chance of something happening. Like planning in advance and actually expecting that bad shit is going to happen so that you don't feel helpless when it does.
For sure. And then I also think that it's important, like ultimately something I try to build with a lot of my clients is a sense of autonomy. I don't want them to work with me because they feel reliant on me or that they need me. I want to build those skills so that they can sort of deal with these issues as best they can. And then maybe I just redirect slightly in terms of their more like longer term plan, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah,
Which I think is important as well. When we have a sense of autonomy and we have this belief that we can have a positive effect on our own pain and sensations, especially right at the onset, I think that plays a huge role in terms of, self-efficacy is huge. So I want to try to water that self-efficacy as best I can and proactively, not just in that moment,
yeah,
but ahead of time so that they can really believe that they can handle it themselves. And then the change that occurs the first time that that flare up does happen, they have that plan, they put it in place. It's kind of crazy how different our conversations are regarding pain after the fact, just simply because they feel like they've got a grip on it themselves, which is such an empowering thing. Like feeling like you have some tools to work on this and that you're not just, riding this boat in these stormy seas and you're just you're at the whims of whatever your body or this pain is going to do to you. You actually feel like you have an oar and you can sort of move in a direction. I think that that's really important for people.
yeah, absolutely. How are you doing for time? Do you have 5, 10 minutes or do you need to go?
Sure do. Yeah, I
You're all
got
good.
time.
Um, One of the last things I wanted to ask you about before we wrap up, uh, I've seen from looking at your profile and the Electrum profile that it seems like you work with a lot of martial artists, BJJ guys, MMA. Um, I guess it's a very open-ended question, but I did jiu-jitsu from time I was maybe like seven, no, but yeah, 18 to 19 maybe, just a small stint. I've worked in a few different sports for S&C. I've always been struck by just how shitty and backwards and outdated the S&C for a sport where you need to be prepared to not get punched in the face or choked unconscious is. What is your perspective on like why is it so bad in martial arts?
That's a great question, and I think it's multifaceted. I think there's two big players. So the first one, especially in jiu-jitsu, is this foundational belief, one of the central tenets of jiu-jitsu, that a smaller, weaker practitioner with superior technique can overcome these physical attributes, right? And, when you're dealing with a trained person versus untrained, that's absolutely true. Um, the issue is that as a practitioner, you're not just dealing with untrained individuals. There's also the fact and the thing that I really try to hammer with people is that when we are sure we're building these physical attributes, but we're also building resilience. We're upgrading the hardware of the system, right? We got you've got the software upgrades, which is your technique within the sport, but the hardware is very important as well, and it plays into your longevity in sport. How long do you want to do jujitsu for? If you're a competitor, do you want to add 2 years to your competitive? I mean, 2 years in a competitor's career is huge, and we can do that if we're intelligent about, being proactive with how we're loading different tissues and, eliciting remodeling and positive adaptation. And also, how are we managing acute injuries? That's something that I think a lot of jujitsu practitioners in particular really mismanage, right? You've got that, obviously, I'm going to really generalize here, but that 4 to 14 day window in the acute phase of injury, these guys experience something that is relatively minor, but they mismanage it in those first 2 weeks, and something that is minor becomes far, far more significant than it ever needed to be. So I think really focusing on strength and conditioning's ability to do those things allows them to circumvent this thing that maybe got them bought in on day one. That whole, Hoist Gracie beating a stronger guy, like sure, but also like take care of your body, right?
Yeah.
The other side of it, and this is a lot more conjecture. Um, what you see a lot in jujitsu uh, are people who were not three sport athletes growing up, right? They were oftentimes picked last on the basketball court in
Smoking weed and riding a skateboard.
yeah, yeah, exactly, right? So they have there are a lot of these not so latent feelings that are like anti-jock,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So because the football team was doing strength and conditioning, well, forget that. We want to get more into this alternative kettlebell stuff, right? Or whatever the case may be. They really spurn anything that has to do with those jocks, even if it is
Yeah.
ultimately useful to them. So that's another thing that's cultural. And I think that the proof of that, here in San Diego, one of the biggest open mats on Sundays is at Legion, at Keenan's gym, and it's huge. Like there are regularly over 100 people at this open mat on Sundays, and it's at the same time as like a bunch of the American football games at that time. You take any other sport that occurs at that time, you would see attendance dip significantly, or at least people talking about it, or but
Yeah.
it's not even a thought in their mind. They don't watch other sports. They don't they've sort of like pushed themselves away from that at large. That's not an absolute rule, but I do think, if you just sit down in a general jiu-jitsu class and you start to talk, you're like, "Oh, the NBA finals are on right now." They're like, "Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't watch." You know?
Same here. I think that is so insightful because, in Ireland, rugby would be a big one. I think there's very little crossover between rugby fans and people who are avid BJJ people. And there is that kind of chip on the shoulder, maybe, of like a lot of people that and it's funny because like I really was not a sporty person growing up at all. I would have been picked last for a lot of things, and I don't know if it's because my introduction to barbell stuff and strength training kind of came laterally through CrossFit. So I didn't like start with going into a gym and doing bench press and bicep curls. I started with these what seemed like, high intensity functional workouts, and the barbell stuff just happened to be in there. And then I realized, oh, I actually really like this, and I think it's probably a bit more effective for my goals. But I think that's super insightful that like I mean, there's such a specific culture to jujitsu in terms of like they're usually only playing like hip hop or reggae and stuff like that in the gyms. The guys are all into wearing like baggier clothes as opposed to like the tight fitting stuff that you might see, like the people who are more kind of like classically gym bros and stuff like that. I don't know if this is a big thing in America, but I've even observed people who are like native born English speakers in Ireland talking like they have a Brazilian accent.
Yeah. Yeah, it's its own weird culture. And yeah, it's not ingrained with other sports the way that other sports are. You go, you when you watch the footage of the NBA finals, who's sitting courtside? It's American football players, it's baseball players, it's athletes from other sports. They love the multi-sport aspect. They love watching human performance at a high level, even if it's not their own sport, right? They're just
Mhm.
very bought into that. And jiu-jitsu doesn't seem to have that culture. So I think that's a big part of it as well. And then you combine the fact that it's a relatively young sport. There's not a ton of money in it yet. Yeah, it's strange for people who have a legitimate strength and conditioning background uh, to want to foray into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or to like specialize in it. Like that's pretty rare.
Yeah, I always like the funniest kind of cognitive dissonance that I always see in fight sports around the whole like supposed people debating like whether or not being stronger and bigger is useful. It's like, well, go fight a guy who's three weight divisions above you. Clearly, the reason you don't want to do that is because you know that he's stronger than you, and when your skill is put up against someone who's also skillful but stronger, there's going to be a problem.
Well, there's a problem there too. A huge part of jiu-jitsu competition is something called the open class or the absolute weight class. So, as opposed to any other martial art, you don't see
Mhm.
this in judo, you don't see it in wrestling, you certainly don't see it in like boxing or MMA. So, on like for example, worlds, you have everybody competing in their weight divisions. And then anybody who places top three in their weight division can then register for a bracket that happens later in the day called the open class. And it's a very prestigious thing to double gold, where you win gold in your division and then you win gold in the open class. And it's also this very common thing that it's not always the guy from ultra heavyweight that wins double gold. And that's kind of like the spirit of jiu-jitsu,
Mm,
right? So
yeah.
there's even that element that with competitors who do know that there's a value in strength and conditioning, they still see guys that are a middleweight winning the absolute at Worlds. And it's just constantly, again, we talk about something like confirmation bias.
Yeah.
If you're just worshiping technique and everything else, you really will take anything that you can to continue to feed that narrative. And even in competition, as opposed to other sports, there is that element. So I really do fall back on just like, hey, we've got hardware versus software. Yeah, man, get your software as high as you possibly can. Train your sport, do so with a high degree of readiness. Really focus on the skill acquisition side of things. I am all for that. I will even I'll structure our training such that it's funny. Now this has been kind of bastardized with the optimal cult, but I am big on fatigue management. And there are different programming strategies that I use to really minimize fatigue with my athletes so that so that it really complements their mat time and it doesn't really compete with it that much. So that is a big thing for me, but we want to really upgrade our hardware over time as well, whether they're a middleweight, whether they're an ultra heavyweight. It's very important. And I think the question remains, I'll be like, hey, what if we could have less injuries over the course of your competitive career and extend the length of time that you are competing? I mean, that should be invaluable for them, and they will see the benefit of that the longer they stick with the strength and conditioning. So, and I think a lot of my strategies to help them manage injury, how to train through pain. I also, a big thing for them uh, is teaching them elements of load management and our degree of control within my four walls of the weight room. That degree of control is way higher than on the mats, even if they don't yet have the confidence. A lot of these guys have been training jujitsu for much longer than they've been lifting weights. So it's funny, left to their own devices, when they're hurt, they'll stop strength training entirely and they'll actually still do elements of jujitsu while they're injured. And what I tell them is like, man, that is ass backwards. Like when we have that injury, sure, we might downgrade our jujitsu to like drilling or whatever we can do where we have a higher degree of control. But man, if it hurts you to pick up the 35-pound dumbbells because of your shoulder injury, guess what we're not going to do? We're not going to pick up the 35-pound dumbbells, right? Like this doesn't have to push you back. And there are many different ways that we can work around that in the weight room. So I provide them this avenue of uh, a very high degree of control over what stimulus they are placing on their body, making sure it's productive, making sure it's not setting them back, and giving them additional tools, especially when they are injured. Because talk about a population where you don't have to convince them that injury is an inevitability. It's in something like jujitsu. Like, bro, you're going to get hurt. They're like, yeah, I know. I'm dealing with three injuries right
Yeah.
now.
They're all fucked
So
up.
yeah, so providing them a tool to better manage that and really preaching that as opposed to just like, oh man, your chokes are going to be stronger. Like, honestly, I talk about that element of things way, way less. Like,
Mhm.
yes, we'll improve your performance and your output on the mats, but way more. I'm just focusing on let's keep this body as healthy as we can. Let's get you out of that injury cycle as rapidly as we can without being reckless or whatever. And that is the value system that allows them to get more bought in long term. And then, of course, once they're bought in, then I bring up things more like, okay, because another thing that's really common, even as they start to get bought in, is they're really motivated in the 8 weeks leading up to a tournament, but they're also training super high volumes for jujitsu. They're cutting weight, etc. That's not the time that we can really build in the weight room. So then the next step, once I do get them bought in, is more of this year-round idea where I go, hey guys, like Worlds happened in the beginning of June. Right now, with a bunch of my competitors, I tell them, I'm like, this is our Worlds camp. the 2, 3 months that happen after your biggest competition is where we're going to really push these variables because you're not training with a crazy high volume anymore. You're not cutting weight anymore. Now is the time that ideally we really push these variables in the weight room now, such that when you get to that next camp, we're dropping the priority level for what we're doing in the weight room. You're really maintaining those variables. And if you can maintain that level of output, even as you cut weight and up your volume for jujitsu, man, that was a 10 out of 10 training year. That's what I then look, it's like these steps of buy-in that I get with them. First, it's like, hey, I'm not trying to challenge you that the smaller, more technical guy will beat the larger, less technical guy. I'm not trying to change any of that. I'm just trying to get you to take care of your body. Finally, get them on board with that. They start to believe me in terms of injury management and load management and that sort of thing. And then I go, hey, for a year, if we want to really crush it and also allow you to be at your absolute best during camp, we're actually going to shift our priority to this time of the year when you have less competitions so that we can really build then and then drop our priority level so that you can really do your best for jujitsu.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I wish there was more S&C coaches doing that sort of stuff with, or I guess really the issue isn't S&C coaches, but it's people that really aren't qualified working with these athletes and getting them doing endless burpees and push-ups and running and whatever. Um, Quickly before we finish up, because I want to be respectful of your time, a couple things that I always like to ask coaches that come onto the podcast. The first one is something that you feel is significant that you've changed your mind on, somewhat recently. I know usually when there's like a big shift in paradigms around things, it typically doesn't happen overnight. And then secondly, any book that you would recommend, maybe that you've read recently. It could be fiction, could be non-fiction, whatever you like.
Cool. Yeah, I think I mean it wasn't all that recent, but a couple years ago, I really changed my mind. I initially writing like a needs analysis for jujitsu because it's such an isometrically dominated sport and a lot of the top athletes are not powerful and explosive. I really dropped my priority for power work with jujitsu athletes very considerably. This was maybe, close to 10 years ago now. Um, I would do some, but the priority was very low. And recently, for a lot of different reasons, I have really upped that priority once again. I think that it's very easy to take a variable and really snatch that low-hanging fruit. I also think when it comes to like plyometrics and power, it's such a great way to start a session. I think you're also providing such a potent stimulus in those ground contacts, something that within such a short window is just not applied to the human body throughout the rest of the stuff that we do. And it's a great way to sort of fill one of those holes that jujitsu doesn't provide for somebody. So that would definitely be a pretty big thing that I've changed my mind on, or at least shifted priorities on in the last 5 or so years. Um, and then a book, as it relates to movement and skill acquisition. I don't know how well you can see this, but it's How We Learn to Move by Rob Gray. I don't know if you're familiar with like ecological dynamics or yeah, it's a very interesting look on motor learning and skill acquisition.
Okay.
Um, I would recommend looking into it. I haven't fully changed my methods in terms of how I approach those things, but it is a very different outlook that really challenges a lot of the ways of how we communicate and teach movement. So I find it very interesting and ways where I can facilitate a bit of self-organization and allowing people to come up with their own
Yeah.
movement solutions. I do find to be extremely valuable. And that book, I mean, there's a ton of references. It is evidence-based.
Is this a bit
I
like
think
constraints-based learning?
yeah. So
Yeah.
CLA,
Yeah.
Rob Gray is one of the pioneers of the
Right.
CLA.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
It's not a super long read. He's got like I think he has 3 books out now. very eye-opening, very intriguing, and he constantly refers back to relevant research, which I find really valuable.
Very cool. Okay, well, I'll definitely check that out myself. And yeah, overall, I just want to thank you for coming on. Um, is there anything that you've got coming up in terms of products or anything like that that you would like to plug or services that people should know about, or if they just want to work with you, where they should go, or to find your content?
Yeah, I think my social media has a good amount of announcements and stuff like that. I do regular programming and stuff via my app, but if you wanted to find me on social media, Alex.Sterner is my Instagram. My business is Electrum_performance and then Electrum Performance on YouTube as well.
Awesome. Okay, I didn't know you had YouTube, so I'll have to check that out. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on, man.